So Diana Daniels actually is a good friend, has spent the last actually 15 years as curator at the Crocker Art Museum. She curated an exhibition, a faculty exhibition, several years ago. 2014. Metaphor, help me out.
It was the metaphysics of time perception.
Time perception.
Really fancy sounding.
Really fancy sounding. I guess it was excellent. And then she also has curated two of our MA exhibition shows over in the Annex Gallery. So let's give a round of applause for Diana Daniels. So when setting up this whole thing, this exhibition, and wanting to do a gallery talk, what better appropriate place to do a gallery talk but in the gallery? But that poses some problems, obviously, with crowds and such, but I'm glad to see everybody's in here and sitting down, and that's why I wanted to be able to have an overspill outside to be able to, for other people who come late, perhaps. We got it? Okay. So that they could actually also experience the talk. So the other thing that Diane and I talked about was that we were going to sort of have this kind of interview format where she's going to ask me questions. And I don't really have any questions for you yet, but I'll have some.
Sure. It'll happen.
It'll happen. So we're actually in a conversation, and then certainly we'll include all of you in the conversation as well. So?
Sounds good. I think there are a few areas of exploration that would be interesting for you to hear about, and certainly it's interesting to hear Andrew relate his process in coming to this work, but I want to start by tackling this idea that we collaborated together. This idea of being a curator is something that's a bit problematic. It can be something that's highly vaunted in television shows or movies. Ray Donovan last season kind of made a big deal about being a curator. And in reality, it's not that much different than a lot of other jobs, except for A, you have the honor of working with really creative people, and B, your real purpose, besides administration, making things come together so that there's wall text, so that the work is done by the deadline, that there's a coherent story being told, is that the curator acts like an editor. Any great novelist is working with an editor who's going in and cleaning up syntax, making sure that sentences don't wander too far away. Even somebody like David Foster Wallace, who has very long sentences, still had an editor working with him. And I think a curator can provide the same thing with a little bit of an outside perspective, to make sure that things stay tight. And with that sort of philosophy being my philosophy, it's interesting to me to have Andrew explain to you why he wanted to collaborate with me on this project.
So, good question, because, and it's something that I've actually been considering and thinking about for quite a while. And I'm going to be long-winded.
That's fine.
I think at this point. But I'll tell you that when I was I grew up in New York, and actually in between my undergraduate and graduate, I worked as a caterer in New York, and we would do these parties like at Estates and in Park Avenue, and it was pretty amazing, a lot of these places that I saw and the people that I met. Well, I happened to, one of the parties that we did was actually a party, a surprise party for a woman by the name of Doris DeLay. Turns out that Doris DeLay was Itzhak Perlman's teacher. So this party that we threw, Yo-Yo Ma, Itzhak Perlman, and all these other like virtuoso violinists came to this thing. It was a amazing concert. She was honored. It was unbelievable. So it was with that I put it together. It's like, there isn't really that kind of thing for artists. There isn't really that kind of like, because they'll have lessons, and they still have lessons, throughout their entire career. And so, not that I'm looking for you for lessons here.
I'm not providing them.
but my point is that there's an opportunity to have a dialogue about what I'm doing, and so they would play their work obviously and get feedback from that.
Traditionally, though, that hasn't been the case for the visual arts.
That's correct.
I think most generations of artists have fiercely protected their vision, especially from curators and curators' editing voices.
That is correct. That is correct. Yeah, and I think, and so I definitely wanted to break that down. And the interesting thing was recently then, I'm a part of an international consortium of artists called Art Knots, and it's spelled just like astronauts, but Art Knots. And so the idea behind that is actually to take art to remote parts of the world. And so we've shown in China, we've shown in South America, Colombia, Venezuela. I mean, it's just a myriad of different places. So there was a 20th annual exhibition of the Art Knots, and they invited a curator by the name of Linda Weintraub, and she's pretty well known in the art world. And so what she asked to do was, it was an exhibition, a rally around the flag, and she asked us to all make works that were about a particular place that our work went that influenced us. So I decided, so she asked us all to do these proposals and send them in to her. So to try to cut it a little bit short, what had happened was that I sent the email with the proposal, and I was like, oh yeah, this is good, this will go. Well, she came back with an email asking me questions, like pointed questions about what my idea was about. Had you thought that this might look like this? What about if you did that? I mean, like getting into my creative process of what I was making. And just was like, at first I was like, why, what is this, And so then I was like, and I talked to a couple people about it, and I was like, all right, look, I'm going to respond politely here. And then so then we actually had several more emails back and forth. And it turns out that I really did change the idea quite a bit. And if you look on my website, it's actually it's the queen size bed. It's two flags that are woven together, an American flag and and the Israeli flag. And ghost images underneath the white parts of the flag are the Palestinian flag. The exhibition was very powerful. So with that, I'm walking on the river last year. I'm thinking, I'm like, I want to do a show, and I want to do a show here, and I want to get Diana to curate the show. And so at that moment, I just said, all right, I'm dialing the phone right now, and I'm calling her. I was out there. It was this beautiful spring day, and that's how it happened.
I pretty much remember, yes, this phone call comes out of the blue saying, do you want to curate a show with me? And I'm like, yeah, absolutely. I'm surprised and honored. It's to talk more about the collaborative process, which I felt went extraordinarily well for us, which is interesting because I can be a very independent type A personality, and so that means sometimes I can be very prickly about my own work. I think the key thing was, for me, that I had some hesitancy about was just, would I transgress any boundaries with you? Because art is your creativity, it's your statement. It's very personal. You're putting yourself out there whenever you do any work for school or for exhibition, which means you're opening yourself up and making yourself vulnerable to criticism. So it would be interesting to hear, how you kept yourself with an open mind and, made sure that, that the process remained comfortable to you as you went forward.
Mm-hmm. I think I got an ego, and we all have them. And I think it's and to contend with your own ego, oftentimes, you really have to have conversations with it. And I think that, one of the things Diana came up to my studio in Placerville for a visit, and that we had planned that sometime in the fall she would come up, and I would, set up all these different things, and then we would have a conversation. And so in my studio, I had like six or seven, really possible directions that the exhibition could go. And because I like to work on different things at the same time. Her coming to the studio was like, I just needed someone to point, like, you need to go here. This is where you need to go. And there was a certain, when she said to me, and we'll still talk about that, This is the direction you need to go. I went, yeah, I guess that's the way I need to go.
It's kind of funny. I didn't know what to expect. I hadn't actually had the honor of paying a studio visit to Andrew up at his place before. Only visited him over at ASL. So you're not sure what to expect, and he has this actually excellent space for displaying work, so people can have an almost white box gallery experience in his studio. And it's a lot of work to lug things out, especially things that are heavy and have complex parts, and get it all set up. And that's always something, as a curator, I have been humbled by whenever I have had the honor of visiting someone at their studio, is knowing that you just don't pop in and say hi. It is a concentrated effort on the person to be prepared for you when you arrive. And I just am always tremendously respectful about the insight that you get behind the scenes, and the fact
it's the show before the show.
It's the show before the show. And that somebody, cares enough to have you be the person that comes in and takes that look and is invited into that experience. But it almost, for me, seemed, once I drove away, almost magical. And I'm a little prone to hyperbole. I like to be an excited, enthusiastic human being, but I'm really, I think, not that voluble in my praises. So I'm like, I don't know what to expect, but I'm driving away, and it was just this feeling, and I tried not to be pushy, I felt. I tried to just be like, I just kept coming back to this one thing. There was other works that were really good. We had an extensive conversation about an earlier work that was influential in the final presentation here, but I just kept coming back to this one concept. So I think it's time to transition to how we ended up here.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it's a very interesting backstory. Why don't you share some of that?
Sure. My home up in Placerville is, you describe it as the farm, which is kind of like the farm. We have lots of animals and all that stuff. But on the way home, there was this one particular house that has, a really nice amount of junk and like good stuff. And I was like, I'd look at it every day, and it just like kept on gnawing at me that I saw in a rack these actually abandoned or whatever tanks, these propane tanks. And so I actually knew the guy, and I'd asked him earlier, it's like, what are you doing with those? Well, I don't know, I got to recycle them, they're my brothers, and so I was like, okay. So it turns out not too long after that, the poor man actually committed suicide. And so the house was then, the family came, and it just was a terrible experience. But as a result, it was like, there was the left detritus. And so it turns out a good friend of mine was the person who went in and did a lot of the remodeling to flip the house again. So anyway, that good friend of mine, I said, Dad, what's going on? And I come over there one day, and he's actually, you see some of the holes in the tanks? He's got like this big drill out, and he's got this other thing, and he's actually trying to cut things. He's like, I don't know what these things are. I think they're stainless steel. I can't cut them. And I'm like, do you want me to take them off your hands? And he was like, yeah, what are you going to do with them? I said, well, I'll make sculpture out of them. He goes, what? So that's the backstory behind finding these. And I brought them up to the studio, and I just kept on doing different things with them. So.
I know that by the time I had paid the visit, you had these cut down in size, and you had these bell pieces with the necks, and you had them mounted on some tripods, and these wooden surveyor's tripods, which in themselves are very impressive acquisitions. Though there was still kind of a disconnect going on between the two parts. But I think the big moment for me was when we started making them ring. And tell us more about your research into the tones and the bells and the things that could be elicited from these shapes.
Sure. it was a moment where this was a while back in the process where I rung them, and at first I was like, do I really want to concentrate on making these bells? And then after a while I sort of okay, let that go. Like, all right, let's take a look at this. And so I started just to investigate how bells operate in different cultures, in our culture, and a lot of times in religious cultures. There's all kinds of different types of bells that are used at different, whether it's in ceremonies, whether it's out in the landscape or at some kind of shrine. But the core of it is that the bell, the clang of the bell, changes it transforms a mindset or transcends a mindset, and so. And actually, when Diana came in the studio, and I actually gave her it was like a PVC stick with some fabric wrapped on it.
Maybe
with
a
some
washcloth or something.
Yes. and I just gave it to her. I said, "Go ahead, hit it." And she hit it, and I swear, your face just like it just changed. And it was that kind of moment where even when in the studio, where I was like, I can see now how this has this transformative quality. And so that was. Before that there was a reluctance, and then after that I was like, all right, well, maybe this is the way to go.
I think I can say this without ending up being on one of these website videos that runs both of our careers, but the events of 2017 were very challenging. I know from my point of view, considering what my family did for a living and friends who've gone into careers in government and for the State Department, et cetera, I have just grown up with appreciation of how delicate the wheels and the machinery of government are. And then with my art history background, aware of how art has survived to us, that lets us know that for thousands upon thousands of years that we have shared across cultures an idea of what leadership should be, and that its depiction in art tends to be very calm and very focused. So one of the things about the bell ringing and the fact that I shared, I believe, with Andrew somewhat of a recognition of that these looked a little bit sort of like World War II munitions. Like the only thing that was missing were the fins and then a big bomb bay to be dropped out of. That the ringing tone seemed to both address my unease, but it also seemed to calm my unease. And I know this was something that you were responding to as well, which led you to explore the symbols that are at the top.
Actually, prior to our meeting, I had already begun that investigation, so there was a fair amount of the symbols that I had already worked on the laser cutter. But I had come to this, it's like exactly in the currents of 2017, and certainly still, so it's just how incredible the steps backwards that we've taken as a culture, at least from the leadership perspective. And so I really wanted to get back to some more of the core, essentially the core of who we are, as a world culture, and certainly as individual cultures. And so I started to explore these different symbols, and one of the things that certainly, I would investigate a particular symbol, like perhaps the Ichi or even sort of the Star of David. But then in the context of all of these different symbols coming together, I found that they began to almost become a little bit more generic, where they actually become more like logos, for company logos and that kind of stuff. So they get kind of reduced, but then as you then go back into and you realize, oh, no, that is an identity, a really important identity of a culture. I really found that kind of really fascinating, this vacillating back and forth between, a symbol for a football team or actually something really, relevant, like, a crucifix or something like that.
Or, a cannabis leaf.
Or a cannabis leaf, yes.
which was also fun too, to keep it just a little bit irreverent. So it wasn't too overbearing. But then again, who knew that the conversation at the time we were meeting in November was going to suddenly get so, lit by the time that we were installing this exhibition. That's a funny word that I chose. Sometimes the neurons, and they're just doing what they do. One of the things that was really interesting is you had already identified these LED spots. Mm-hmm. And so when you had the prototypes that you had cut from the Plex, it was interesting to see the shadows that were cast and to see that there was an opportunity as a sculptor to take over the wall space as well.
Yeah.
And do you feel like it functions like painting in a way?
I guess it does, like painting. I mean, certainly one of the things that when we were working on setting up the exhibition, these walls were clearly like the canvas. I mean, it was like we were trying to think, we actually didn't really have that much of a clue. We were shining the light, see what it was going to look like, what the projection was going to look like. But it certainly as a composition, and thinking about just a rectangular composition in space, it really does work that way as far as painting goes.
So one of the conversations we had, now that you elaborate more, as I said, I'll set it up, is that we were... Oh, it went to sleep, sorry.
It went to sleep. I have to put in my password, sorry.
I'll continue to set it up. Was from seeing the projection and with these incredible spots, LED lights, very intense, very focused, that you could get such a sharp outline on the wall, as he was demonstrating in the studio, and then with the color added in, and then thinking about how solemn the intonation, the ringing, the resonance from the bells could be in this space. It's like, we talked about, well, how would we see that vision, and started to think of it as being in a darkened space, in that in some ways adding in the color with its, through its translucency, could sort of evoke a different aspect of spirituality, which is using color and light, whether it's in a, more of a Gothic cathedral sense or a contemporary church experience kind of sense, or even just in any setting where you want to add a little bit of stained glass, and how that could further this feeling of meditation even. There's these cues, and bells have played part of those cues in history that we have when we go into certain spaces that tell us that we need to lower our voices, for example, that we need to take off our shoes in another example, that we need to alter our mood, alter our mindset as we go into the space, because there's a different expectation inside. And so things such as lighting, as dimness, having some color to control, outside light is all part of that phenomenon. Mm-hmm. So that's my setup, so I'll let you go on.
Okay.
No real question there, but just
right.
setup.
But I get, well, one of the things I've been thinking, certainly when creating the installation for the space, was that, in fact, you have both the concrete and the abstract existing in the space at once. So the objects themselves are what we were presented with physically, and then the projections then become the abstractions. They become the result of these objects in the space. All you need to do is take away the light, and those things just immediately go away. I found that to be really a very interesting kind of juxtaposition, that you would have the physicality of these objects, and yet then you have these abstractions, and then not only that, then what happens with the abstractions is like in particular on this wall, the order in which some of the symbols that you see in the space then become reordered in a way that maybe you're not seeing physically, but then you're seeing it in the projections in another kind of light.
Another aspect then that seemed really key as we were considering all of these options was that this was an opportunity to allow you to make the experience of the space whatever you will of it. So you can come in and you can just be quiet, or you can ring the bells, or you can go crazy and ring them all, run around in circles if you want. But it was an opportunity to leave it kind of open-ended. But that led to the challenge of what to do about those tripods.
Yeah.
So Andrew, what was the moment? Describe for everyone that moment that led you to this really, really technically perfect answer.
Thanks. It really took a long time to arrive to the place.
Explain the tripods, though.
Explain the tripods. Well, the tripods sucked. They just did not work. They weren't really the solution to the problem, and they were not in a way really adding to exponentially in any way to the equation that I was trying to create.
And I don't think they ultimately would have been stable enough.
They ultimately were not stable enough, and they were not yet. No, they wouldn't really hold these things, and they wouldn't. I was going to have to do some really kind of redesigning and reinforcing of things, and that they held such an identity. And that was the interesting thing about them, though, and what they served in the process was that those tripods, those surveyors' tripods, had a very strong identity, and so that's what was functioning well. And so my thinking was then, okay, so something else needs to take that place. So when Diana came out to the studio, I had this other piece that I resurrected, and was going to redesign, and essentially it's this large frame, aluminum frame that was lined with rope light. You guys are all familiar with rope light, but it held this kind of quality temperature light that both of us, being of the same vintage generation, were brought right back to the 70s, and we were just looking at these things and just the conversation got to be so intense about our current experiences and how essentially what's happening today is actually wanting to recreate what's going on, what was going on in the 60s and 70s, meaning, and all-inclusive, right? A capitalist culture where discrimination and racism and sexism is okay and discussed and abused in a public manner. And so I started to go back then to the 60s and 70s to look at all these different pieces of architecture.
One of the things about this particular piece with the rope lighting sandwiched between the glass and aluminum frame was that it really was evocative of this late 1960s, 1970s glam look that I associated from where I grew up with big oil money.
Studio 54.
Exactly,
yes.
and these hotels that would have elevators on the outside of the building, and they'd have the big giant showbiz lighting around the mirrors up. So the elevators would glow at night as they're going up and down. And everything had a lot of chrome to it, a lot of brass, and then a lot of light reflecting off of it. And it just, this idea of the big power of that generation felt. And I think sort of a shared thing, like we just can't get out from underneath our parents' generation. No matter how hard we try. Yeah. That all came together. Yeah. And what was it about picking the skyscrapers themselves then? How did we make this leap? We're thinking about the look, the glamour of this very corporate identity. And then what made you pick up iron and decide to start putting things together?
Certainly one of the things that I really love in my work actually is linear interpretations. And so, but when I started to do some research about that time, and it just actually started to really wash over me. Growing up on Long Island, I watched the World Trade Center being built. I saw it like basically floor to floor, and you could watch it on the horizon. So many of these different buildings from the New York perspective. Actually, the Pan Am building is another really prevalent building in New York that it's something that it's just a part of me. Thinking about actually how, I mean, my parents, my father was an auto mechanic, and he worked in the auto industry, and he was, he was a veteran, and was on the GI Bill and got trained, and and he lived the American dream, leisure culture of the 50s and moving into the 60s, and so but then these cathedrals, these symbols, these skyscrapers, it's like it was always, well, it was either one of two things in the 60s and 70s, which is still happening today. The strive for the sky, like how high can you build a building, and then the other thing that was happening was space travel, going into space, and so the space race, right? So in choosing then these buildings, I was really looking at ultra modern buildings, very simple, straightforward, dominant features that are just architecturally reduced to very simple kinds of geometric shapes. A1 was because certainly the construction of these would make it a little bit simpler for me, but secondly that the ominous modernist quality of these pieces, these buildings, and how they remain to be these these icons of a time period in American culture.
So I think this is the big dividing line that had me give up on a fine arts degree and move over to art history, was that whatever it is where, the wires connect in your brain, cross those hemispheres, wherever that is that creativity springs from. And as an armchair neurologist, I know that the researchers now say it comes from all over the place. There is no hemisphere for creativity, no single one. And it's, the ability to, with just a few lines, so clearly convey these buildings. I mean, most of them I could recognize right off the bat. And certainly one like the Transamerican Pyramid's very, very obvious. And I liked as well that you picked something from the West Coast, since we're in the West. But I also found it a little haunting to have the old Twin Towers and then the new Freedom Tower juxtaposed. And that seems to be very personal for you.
Absolutely.
When you were drafting these together, is this just something that comes to you naturally? Is it something, you said you liked minimal graphic line? Explain more about how how it is that your brain is wired, that you come up with these great reductions that are still, they communicate so clearly.
Well, one of the things that was exciting about so much of this project was that with each phase of it, I was doing levels of investigation and research that, until I felt satisfied that I was like, okay, I think I have enough information here. So when I started to study these different buildings, I actually I realized that right off the bat, it's like, okay, well, I could render these things and just sort of throw them together, but they wouldn't have the identity that references that particular building. I don't like to admit this, but I do. I do like math. There's parts of me that really enjoys doing calculations, and
we were actually very rigorous about the measurements and placement. The math seemed to matter.
It did matter. It did matter in the space, and it mattered to each individual piece, and yeah. So I had to, for each building, find essentially sources. A couple of them had to go to the library, my local library, to actually get accurate dimensions, so I could actually then calculate them and reduce them down so that they would be proportionately correct. Because obviously any of one of these buildings, so these are to scale. They vary from anywhere from 0.03 to 0.05, I believe, in terms of their scale.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
I think that's part of the reason why they feel right.
That's why they feel right. Yeah, and throughout the process, I was like, You know, I got really detailed with it. And I thought you being too over, you know, just relax with it, you know. So even part of the later buildings that I created, I started to just sort of like, okay, well, you know, I can make that work, and sort of just getting more confidence in the rendering of these buildings. You know, so I mean, one of my favorite buildings actually is the Sears Tower. In terms of its geometry, it's just a really very simple, exciting, interesting, and starting from the base, it's 9 squares. That's all it is. And then those 9 squares just, you know, go up into each one of these individual kinds of, you know, spaces. I've never been in the building, so I really would like to actually explore it. Yeah, yeah.
It is very cool to go to the top and press your nose and lean out.
Yes, yeah.
They do. Well, they used to let you do that. I don't know.
Yeah, yeah. So, but the interesting thing was that actually I had began with the World Trade Center. That was the first building that I created, and noting that, you know, that the building is gone, and you know, where was I going to actually take the rest of this? Then I started to embrace all these other different cities and other skyscrapers that were really of that same vintage and that same time period. So
I don't know, I like to take things to a heavy place. I can be accused of overthinking everything, and that's my failing. But with the World Trade Center, I felt like that was an important note in trying to make something relevant to this particular moment, because, again, it suggests the fragility of all of our systems. I mean, you can build something as massive as these towers and have them made out of, you know, rigorous materials, steel, with amazing engineering, and there can still be flaws. And it just takes a little bit of malice, and everything changes. So in a time when there seems to be so much malice in the dialogue, and even things that are supposed to be said that are supposed to be unifying, there still seems to be malice of intent behind them. I found that was a great way to juxtapose any sort of connotations that, well, we're celebrating our greatness, we're celebrating our accomplishments, with a reminder of how much you have to be mindful that nothing is permanent and that everything has to be guarded. And what were the first reactions that you received from someone besides me to the pieces?
In the gallery here, or like
with your family?
Just with family and stuff. You know, where's my family? Where's my family? What is that, Dad? What is that? You know, it's like that's not the question you asked me. It's like, I'm not going to tell you what it is. You've got to tell me what it is. You know, so oftentimes that's the immediate question. But I think one of the things that certainly was coming about was when people were coming into the studio. You know, they were not recognizing these as being representations off the bat. It wasn't until I sort of clued them into it that they were representations. Then it was like, oh, yeah, I guess so. Yeah, now I see it. And so I really I like that a lot, because the fact that you could live in that identity of what these actually representations are, or you could enjoy them as sculptural forms, you know. And so certainly in my interpretations of them, I was interested in, you know, the different materials, the different actually dimensional materials of the steel, and how then that actually translate into the linear qualities of each one of the buildings. So yeah, I don't know if I answered your question, but
no, I think that's good. I would say one of the things that's also pretty remarkable about creativity, and since most of you are students to discuss, is the fact that you were full steam on this, because we meet 1st of November, and from possibilities, I give you my suggestion, what seems to be most authentic, and out of options. And then you have to move ahead and solve all these problems, like what to mount them on, you know, how to make it relevant to and coherent to the pieces. So if we've already got the stained glass connotation with shining lights through the plastic discs, and we have bells, which are used for spiritual purposes, for meditation purposes, then, referencing, again, the cathedrals of the 20th, 21st century then makes sense. But for me, what was amazing was then the short turnaround. So once you hit on the idea, then what was it that kept you motivated to kick this out? Because there were no end of distractions possible at that time of year.
That's so true. Christmas and everything. Yeah.
It seems to be the one thing that unites most artists is that the work comes first in some ways, that there is an ability to focus in on it. So what was driving you in this time period, besides just fear of missing a deadline?
Well, fear is a good motivator, that's for sure. But one of the things that is really, deadlines are really good for us, really. They're good for me because then I really know that I got to get something done. And there's certainly a bit of anxiety in the process. But there's just something about when for me faced with a whether it's a conceptual or visual problem, that it occupies every waking moment. It really is just, it's like every day that I'm waking up, I'm like thinking, okay, today and I'm going to be fabricating this work, and this is the next stage of that. And certainly in the inception of the idea, that was really critical in terms of, it's like, okay, there's this piece here. Now what is going to actually continue to be its complements within space? The nice thing I think that happens, and I was describing this actually in one of my classes, was that, in fact, in the process of making, when you're having this when you're in this flurry of this activity, is that decisions need to be made, and they need to be made now. And so, and not only are they aesthetic decisions, but they're also production decisions, or solutions to actually how do you actually construct these things, because each one of them presents a different kind of geometric problem and assembling them. And at any one of these buildings, I can tell you that they all have actually a wooden counterpart that I actually created an wooden armature that would then keep them all in their correct order. So then I could then add in the verticals or the horizontals actually make them. So I was just in like complete, this is, every day and thinking about, but basically it would be every day in the studio, welding, grinding, producing, and then every night I would be on the computer actually drawing, calculating, and putting stuff together to try to figure out the next day's work.
You were involved in the
Insanely,
problem,
yes.
in the problem solving. When you have this space to yourself, as we're finishing installation, and what were you thinking when it's like near completion, and we're close to opening the doors, and were you seized with a desire to run around and make them all ring and have this private personal moment, or were you just at that point so tired? Everybody thinks installing art is fun.
Yeah.
It's actually the most painfully physical thing that you can go through, really. What was your last sort of emotional versus intellectual thought before opening the doors and sharing this?
Yeah. I think I've spent a lot of my work, and I've said this to my students too, that making simple images and works is so much more difficult than making complex ones, if that makes sense. Meaning, it's by getting all of this stuff to work properly, and with minimal materials, economically, visually, it takes a lot of precision and and I get very involved in that. So why I said that first is because when I came in, when finally that was Monday, it was going to open, the show was going to open, and certainly much of the installation in the space was actually firstly thinking about how these things were going to exist in the space, but then actually creating the theater and how these things were going to be projected in the space and how that was going to then be that transformative space. I have to tell you that actually Summer was in here on that day when the show opened, and Summer Ventus, and so there were people coming in. It was exciting. It was like, oh cool, they come in, and then like so Summer's like trying to hit this bell, and I'm like, you gotta really whack it. And I showed her how to whack it, and that thing just snapped off the top of it. And I was like, shit! Oh no! So it was like, okay, now problem solved. What do we do? Because prior to that moment, it was perfect. And I had that moment. It was like, it's here. It's here. It's happening. It's done. It's like, a really wonderful feeling, a really beautiful exhale, in that moment, but it's never really done. That's the whole thing about it.
So ultimately, by participating in the space, we've talked a lot about the things that we were thinking about. But if we're putting ourselves into the shoes of another generation, what are you hoping they might find in spending a few minutes banging on a bell and looking at the walls?
I think, in describing earlier that sort of transcendence or transformative kind of quality, how is it that when you sort of come into this space, one of the my credos or objectives as an installation artist is that although this is the Robert Ellis Gallery, I want people to enter into this space as if it's not the Robert Ellis Gallery. That they recognize it as the architecture of the gallery, but never before have they actually seen it look like this. And so, there's a lot of attention to, saying, okay, that's going to be the entrance. This is how you're going to actually experience the space. And I mean, you were actually extremely instrumental in creating the type of space and type of experience that I was really interested in creating. And so, because we spent several hours in placing each one of these and each one of them as being a breath, in the space. And so, if there's time for people to have moments of reverence, meditation, in the title of the show, an exaltation, a feeling of elation, a feeling of relief, wonderful, and as we know, we walk out the door or we look at our tablet or our phone, and we're, brought back to reality of like, yeah, this is really what's happening today. To noting that, we do share all of this. We do share these experiences. We are all the same.
Of course, if we want to demystify the whole thing, sometimes it just feels good to hit something. And this is a constructive way of letting that out, even if it's not because you're in a bad place, just because sometimes it just feels good to make a sound.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I think we've gone for about an hour now, maybe more. It seems like everyone's getting
we
restless.
have.
So I want to conclude my part by saying that I think Andrew gave me far too much credit for this. Seeing my name big on the walls, when you work in a museum, it's about the museum, it's not about the person, so you don't see your name big on the wall like that, and that's really big, and it makes me feel like I played far too big of a role in this, but on the other hand, it was an exceptional experience to be a curator collaborating with an artist, because I think the vast history is more of sort of a hostile takeover kind of a situation once a curator gets involved. So thank you for this amazing opportunity. And I don't know if you want to say anything to conclude, but thank you all for listening and coming in and hearing us talk about this really amazing journey we took.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. I guess we'll open it up to questions, if you guys have some questions for the both of us.
Hello.
Hi.
If you don't know this already, if you could have any permanent placement for your sculptures in the world, where would you want them to be placed?
Any permanent place for them?
The National Mall.
Nothing is permanent. I don't think that'll be it, really. As an installation artist, one of the reasons why early on in my career as an artist doing this type of work was that I completely embraced the idea that this is temporal. This is a temporal existence, a temporal experience, and that that this work, this show exists for a time. It is an experience for the people who can experience it, and then it moves on. So yeah, to answer your question, this is it. You better experience it now because it's going away. Other questions? Yeah.
Could you ring one of the bells for us?
Oh yeah.
Absolutely.
I was waiting for that. Thank you. Thanks for asking. Yes?
I just want to thank you. Everybody came here and wanted to see the bells ring. So thank you.
Oh, for doing that. One of the things that I did sort of in the beginning, that was all. She asked me, Diana asked me about, the feeling of when it first opened and such. I was really concerned about how it takes a level of skill. It's like you really have to, kind of snap your wrist, and if you're not a percussionist, you might not be able to get that right. But I realized after a while, it was like they'll get it. They'll be able to, make it ring, and even if it doesn't have quite the ring that others can get, it's still that they still will have the experience. So I was actually looking at lots of redesigns of my mallets.
And you bring up an interesting point because you haven't felt comfortable ringing the bells. Is that the case?
It was different. I came in by myself. It was kind of meditative to ring the bells. But then with people around, it's like a performance.
Right.
Sometimes it's kind of awkward or people are laughing. And it's just a different experience. But I like them both, and I thought of it as a performance. So I wanted to see them all.
Yeah. And we had this conversation too, that not that many art experiences are participatory. I mean, there's artists out there that make their entire practice about trying to have, that active engagement instead of a passive traditional viewer role. So it's like, well, how do we make sure that it doesn't feel so precious that people won't take the mallets? And I think we came down to, well, let's put up a little text on the wall that says, gives you permission to break some norms. And then ultimately we just were, I think, hopeful that the mallets were just too tempting not to play with.
Actually, some others have commented about how almost the mallets are like they're the human part. They're like the organic part of these works that actually are one of the most inviting parts of because the tactile feel of them and the softness of them.
Was there actually a desire to change the intonations of the bells? Was that ever a thing, or was that just a choice to make them all sound the same?
Yeah. So when I had cut them in half and started to ring them, and all of a sudden realizing that dimensionally and physically they were ringing at the same tone, it unfortunately became this cliche that's like, okay, all of these different belief systems, all of these different experiences, all these different cultures, there's a commonality that their spiritual journeys have a similar direction, and so having them be the same or similar, because some of them that they're sharp, you hear them, they're a little bit different than others, and there's a dissonance that happens, so it adds to the vibration of the bells. The other part of that, to answer that question, is that one of my best friends is a percussionist back east, and I did consult with him actually on the nodal quality of the bells, so that to make sure that they would ring to their maximum. But we also, in the conversation of talking about it, because I was thinking, because one of the possibilities I thought about was like, well, having a bunch of musicians come in here and actually do a piece, have to do a performance on these pieces, as a composition. So it may happen. Yeah, John.
With the Art Not program that you were talking about, did you travel with those shows, or was it just the art center?
I haven't yet, and but I've certainly just haven't had the opportunity to do that yet with the organization. But it's on my bucket list, or at least more than buckets, several buckets. Yeah.
What was the most emotionally challenging part of this process?
Emotionally challenging. Well, my life is emotionally challenging. So I'm not sure how. But I will have to say something. So this piece actually behind us here was the last piece that I made. And it was, there was still time before the installation of the show. But there was a point where I was figuring out the configuration of everything, and then I realized it was like this building, which is the Pittsburgh Steel Building, U.S. Steel Building, not Pittsburgh Steelers, but the U.S. Steel Building in Pittsburgh. It's such a really interesting, it's just a really strong, very image of a building. When I finished it, I put it up in my studio, and I stood back from it, and I just lost it. It was just like, I can't believe it, I got it done, I'm done. And it was just, but not only that, was like, that piece was like, it was so powerful. It was like, and it really struck me. It was really cool moment in the studio.
I think we were both sort of aware in our conversations too, like we had, there's a lot of associations for us, things from, just comparing generations, comparing the way things change. Obviously, as we said, being influenced by our current moment and trying to make sure that things wouldn't be kitsch. That there would be not only literal resonance, but figurative resonance to what we were doing. And so I think, for me, it was pretty emotional to see the buildings as these final supports holding up the bells. And because it really seemed like there was where intent and idea and message and material all came together. And I think that's a big challenge when you're an artist, to get all of your skills get your mastery of your materials, get it all pulled together, and then arrive at a point where you say something with clarity, and you say it in a way, though, that's still open enough for other people to experience the way they want to. And so I know that was emotional for me.
That's good. I think we should end there. I like that.
All right.
Oh, you got one more question? One more question.
Would you identify the buildings? Would you start over here?
Sure. John Hancock Building, Chicago. This one right here. Yeah. The Aon Center, or used to be the AMCO Building, and that's there's one in Los Angeles. There's another one, very similar, same architectural firm in Houston and in Chicago.
So they used to be Standard Oil, right?
Standard Oil. This is originally was the Pan Am Building in New York City. It's now the MetLife Building. That's a very prominent building, really early on in the history of New York, and there was a lot of controversy around the building of that building. You all know this building. Come on. Transamerica Buildings, San Francisco, World Trade Center, U.S. Steel Building, Pittsburgh. The Freedom Tower, the one that replaced the World Trade Center, and then now what's called the Willis Tower, which was the Sears Tower in Chicago. And actually, just to make a point, the Freedom Tower is actually the only 21st century building represented in here. So this is the current sort of representation of what's happening now, essentially, in comparison to the rest of the building. One more, all right, come on.
Just knowing that now, and then noticing that you put like the weed plant on top of that, is that kind of like this, dealing with this, whatever's going on?
Thank you. Oh, it was a great audience. Thank you very much.
We did have that conversation.
Yes, we did have that conversation. Yes, absolutely. All right, well, we'll mill about. Thank you all for coming. There's food outside and stuff. Thank you.